Okay, welcome to this episode of the KPMG ESG Experts podcast. In this series of podcasts, we aim to give you more insight into different CSRD-related issues. We also want to share some concrete steps you could take to start solving those issues and use real-life examples while doing so. In this episode, we'll talk specifically about the double materiality assessment, the DMA, and the role of the value chain in CSRD. And specifically, we zoom in a little bit on the width of the value chain and how that actually applies to assessing impacts, risks, and opportunities for companies. I'm your host, Pieter. Luckily, I'm not alone here, but I'm joined here by some colleagues, amazing experts in the field. I'm very pleased to have them with me today, Midge, Anton, and Audrey. So it would be nice if you could shortly introduce yourself before we dive into the matter. So maybe, Midge, you can start.
Sure, Midge Prudon. I'm here to talk about sustainability reporting, but really give the assurance lens to it all. So that's my role here today, and I'm excited to be here. Anton?
Anton Zhigalov, sustainability reporting advice. So we help companies to prepare with their double materiality assessment and greater CSRD journey so that their information is trustworthy and assurance ready.
Audrey.
Yeah, I'm Audrey Bozec. I'm a manager in the sustainability reporting team. I actually do a bit of both reporting advisory and assurance in regards to the CSRD.
Cool, good stuff. I think maybe we start first with you, Audrey, and also to get the listeners a bit into the subject again. I suppose you're already a little bit familiar with it, but maybe you can explain a bit about the context of why is the DMA so important within the CSRD, and what is the role of the value chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of companies now are preparing to report against the CSRD. And of course, there's a couple of core components to the CSRD. The first one being the double materiality assessment, because as part of the double materiality assessment, companies identify their most material impacts, risks, and opportunities, which link to the reporting scope of the entity. And within the double materiality assessment, the value chain itself is actually a very important part as well, because you have to identify your impacts, risks, and opportunities not only within your own operation, but also in your upstream and downstream value chain. And that actually extends the reporting that most companies are used to doing at the moment.
Cool. And maybe Midge, maybe you can chip in a bit here. If you look at it from an assurance perspective, how do you see the role of like the DMA in doing your work there?
So the DMA, obviously from an assurance perspective, comes into play when we provide assurance over the sustainability reporting of a client. I think for the listeners it's crucial to understand that we do not only provide assurance over compliance with the ESRSs, so does a company really adhere to all the requirements that are in the ESRS, but also in the process, how did they arrive to the sustainability reporting scope? And that is obviously what the DMA sort of sets the standards for. So yeah, that is the both lenses that we provide assurance over.
Yeah.
So that's why it's also important to really have a good conversation with your assurance provider on a timely basis.
Yeah. And I can also imagine that some parts in that are also new for you and for the whole assurance practice in general. Yeah. This will be the first year that ESG assurance for CSRD will come into play for some of the bigger companies, but we might touch upon that later as well. And then specifically today, I already introduced it a bit. We want to talk also about some of the challenges. There are probably a lot of challenges. We can't tackle them all in this podcast, but maybe Anton, you can take us a bit along if you look at the value chain to start with. It's a very broad concept, and how actually, what is difficult around that for companies and in the DMA and in general maybe.
Thank you, Peter. You actually started with the challenge number one, the breadth of the value chain. And it's easier said than done to actually know your value chain, identify those impacts, risks, and opportunities along the value chain, and then assess. We may think of a few key challenges there. Actually, knowledge of the value chain, of those components and business relationships, indirect business relationships with actors in your value chain is not on the surface for some of the areas or some of the sectors. And this knowledge may be scarce at the moment of mapping where where those potential high-risk areas are, leading to hardship and really challenges with identification and especially assessment. So from not knowing what you're exposed to not knowing how material that is. And that lack of knowledge may evolve and may materialize as a crucial risk of its own, actually. Yeah. If you miss that step early on in your journey down to assurance readiness, of course, and to mislead potentially your report readers, which may or may not have the same understanding of your value chain. So that knowledge is key and sits in all of the steps of your CSRD journey. Cool.
And then specifically looking into the information that you need from that value chain, you already talked a bit about it. Yeah. And if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
We may refer to the language of the standards, and that will sound a little bit more formal, but from that we can understand many things. Maybe let's start with formalities. The value chain should be understood as those business relationships, direct and indirect, with business actors along your value chain. And for every single word I just said, there is a definition. What is a business relationship? What is actor? And what is value chain? So it might be confusing. In very simple terms, you should look at the presence of your organization and what elements of the world around you it interferes, whether it's a nature, whether it's society or community, in fact, whether those can be contractual relationships with your suppliers. So everything where your company is exposed to, or everything what your company is exposed to make your products or services be consumed at the very end, is actually your value chain. Okay. Information about those interactions is crucial. Yes. Yeah. What exactly those links and interactions are, dependencies or effects on the environment and society. Those are the linkages we start identifying first and then assessing the gravity, or speaking Israel's language again, severity and likelihood of materializing, whether it's a risk or opportunity.
Yes. And I can also imagine that maybe some companies or in some areas it might be easier to find that information than for others, right?
Well, that's so much true. We see the availability of information for various topics, and equally so for various sectors, is different. We happened historically to start with climate change maybe being the topic number one to go into the value chain. Yeah. And for some sectors which are the key contributors to climate change, we again have more knowledge about those elements of the value chain and actors along the value chain. We switch topic, we switch sector, and then we have severe challenges to knowledge, to any tools available, and a common practice. Okay.
It's actually a quite interesting topic, right, Anton? I mean, you bring up climate change, and the other day I got this example from one of the clients that I was serving. He said, well, if you look at it, if you look at the value chain and the relevance of it, if you would solely look at an oil and gas company, right, they produce oil and gas, the gasoline, when it comes into the car, that is where it actually starts the pollution, right? I mean, that is where the greenhouse gas emissions are actually in the downstream become relevant. So if you solely would look at the oil and gas company itself, you would miss out on all the downstream emissions, and that's why the relevance of the value chain. And when I heard that example, it really resonated with me, and I hope it also does to the listeners today.
Yeah, I can understand. And as I said before, I can imagine from an assurance perspective that this value chain becomes now more important also for topics where traditionally was not, let's say, a major area of interest, because it often was also not, well, it was not needed necessarily to report on this. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine that there you have some interesting conversations with your clients there. Yeah. You probably already had them, I guess, as a preparation on this process.
Very much so, because Anton already mentioned it in the E1, and on carbon we already have scope 3, and we have a greenhouse gas protocol which is very mature. are relatively mature in the ESG world, but there is way more topics, right? I mean, even for the social topics, the value chain obviously is a very crucial part, and that is where most of the conversations with the clients are at the moment. From an assurance perspective, is how easy is that information being obtained, and what are the efforts that the clients go through to get the information from the value chain.
Yeah. Okay, so we've discussed already a couple of examples in between the lines, but maybe we can look in a specific example where we see that these challenges play a role. Anton, can you provide me there with some?
Yeah, let's dive into it, and maybe let's make a sidestep from climate change.
It's always a good thing to do.
Okay, then you have human rights. Let's think of an industry that's all around us. Car producers, and electric cars in particular, would have batteries. And batteries these days are produced by a small number of manufacturers. And raw materials, and especially minerals, required for these batteries come from a small number of geographies. And it happened to be researched or investigated that mining of those raw materials doesn't come without certain issues. What would come to your mind is issues around health and safety, human rights abuse, and certainly some environmental issues related to waste management, waste treatment, water management, water recycling, and water consumption. So if you think of this example, the availability of information about those issues may be not a problem. These days, those topics can be researched and explored enough to be publicly available.
And these are also topics that we even see in the news, right? That even people not really dive into these topics know a bit about already.
You see, those are the clues to make a reporter or company and us as advisors and assurance providers be informed about potential issues or high-risk areas in the value chain of a car manufacturing company.
Excellent.
What is left then? The decisions and dilemmas, whether you acknowledge the presence of those impacts, risks and opportunities in your value chain, and how much you think those impacts, risks and opportunities are material to the sustainability of your organization. Those are still not easy to answer questions.
But at least the basis is set. Some of the information is there.
Exactly.
Yes. So we just talked about a really big issue together with Anton, and are there also any other challenges as well regarding the DMA and the value chain?
Yeah, absolutely. Another challenge that companies are facing is more specific to the assessment itself and the quantification of the impacts, risks or opportunities that are present in their value chains. And there, for the assessment, we know that quantitative information provides the most objective assessment, but we also know that having quantitative information available for the assessment of impacts, risks or opportunities within the value chain is a struggle at the moment. So data is mainly available within the own operation of companies, and they're used to reporting on that information, but then when we have to start looking at the data within the value chain to really provide this objective assessment, it becomes more difficult. And there the standards actually say that a company should put in reasonable efforts to obtain that information, and that if it has put in reasonable efforts to do so, but the information is not available, that it can actually use estimates or proxies for the assessment of these impacts, risks and opportunities. So in the case of the batteries, for example, if you were to assess, let's say, a potential impact on your affected communities, perhaps linked to the topic of water scarcity as well, if that information is not, quantitative information is not available for the assessment, you would start looking at external secondary available data to complete your assessment and then justify which impact is perhaps more important to your company and therefore more material.
And specifically that last part, right? How do you look at this? Like, what is more important?
Well,
yeah, I was just going to chip in. I mean, this is obviously where it gets interesting for me as an assurance provider, right? I mean, the client the clients that we serve mostly adhere to estimates and proxies in their value chain information, because the topics that Anton just talked about, say child labor or other human rights issues. I mean, if you go to your provider or your supplier and you ask, okay, how many human rights related issues did you have last year? I mean, it's not a sexy topic to really disclose, right? So you don't want to tell your customer how many cases you had, even if the normal answer that we get is there's nothing to see here.
Yeah.
And that is where it becomes interesting. And as an insurance provider is, okay, can we really say that the company put in all the effort to get the upstream information, or downstream could also be a case,
Yep.
To justify that they can use estimations or proxies, or should they go one step further?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we, as a practice, right, together with clients, need to mature over time.
There's also, I can imagine, there's also quite some professional judgment in there, right?
Correct.
To understand like how reasonable is the effort, has the effort been, and as you mentioned, and then how do you well, practically, how do you compare, for example, if you look at there, it might be a certain health and safety risk deep down in the value chain somewhere versus health and safety which you know of, which you have the quantified data about. So let's say in the positive case that you have the data, how then do you look into both? How do you say this was a focus area and this we focus a bit less on or later? Or?
Well, you would need to focus on every potential impact, risk, or opportunity that you have identified, right? So not having the quantitative information available or in-house doesn't justify that a topic may be less material or not. And then really to identify which one is most important to you, you would go through then the assessment, so also dictated by the different criteria that you need to look into in the ESRSs, and finalize this assessment to come to a proper conclusion.
And maybe if I can add to this, the sense of different issues or certain impacts and risks and opportunities being material is actually turning to be a question of not comparing them as such to which one is more material, but rather to seeing these issues as issues threatening your corporate resilience. Your company ultimately can either continue to prosper by actually being in tune with the society and the nature it depends on and it serves,
of course,
or threaten those relationships. And
I guess also that's why the CSRD has been developed, right?
So
and why it is into play now.
So true.
But on the other hand, I can also imagine that companies cannot do everything at the same time. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
But you also had a second example I think you wanted to talk about.
Or that would be an example maybe a company would actually prefer to not do, maybe, or deprioritize.
Okay, interesting.
Imagine a shipping company that actually ships the raw materials or electric cars, ready-made electric cars, from a country where they have been produced to a country where they are sold.
Yes.
So the shipping company doesn't own any facilities or premises where raw materials are, fabricated or where those labor issues arise.
They own the
ships. However, they own the ships.
They're good at shipping, so they own the ships and they control the ships.
If I ask you, would you then associate the child labor or human rights issues and health and safety issues at large that are attributed to the industry of goods you ship to the shipping company, and how material this would be? This question becomes much more ambiguous, maybe.
So what if they, for example, ship all kinds of things? So
what if they do, in fact,
bananas to clothing to, let's say they ship almost everything from every value chain in the world. Are they then responsible for the whole world, basically, right?
Even the way you formulate it is super interesting. You actually just made the equation of material issues to responsibility, which I very much like personally. This word is nowhere in the standards, but in the sense of understanding the regulation and CSRD as a directive, I think it's an act of responsibility. So imagine if you just imagine a shipping company wouldn't ship these goods, they wouldn't be sold. And maybe the market would shrink, and maybe the production facilities wouldn't be needed, and then those issues or those employees wouldn't be hired. So if that rationale works, then a shipping company certainly contributes to the issues associated with the industry or the goods it ships. Then should this company take a responsibility or not? That's the ultimate question of the value chain.
I can also imagine that there might be a difference between, let's say, a shipping company that ships always the same goods. So maybe they even subcontracted by another company to always ship all of their goods, versus a company that ships whatever is brought to them, right? So let's say as a shipping company, you're part of one specific value chain and you always are active there, or you're in, how from an assurance perspective would you look into the difference?
I mean, I was just going to respond to Anton's point. I mean, because I fully agree with that perspective, right? There's always an alternative. Most of the clients that we talk to say, well, I don't have really an impact on the human rights issues that occur at my supplier. Well, there's always an alternative. And that is the type of conversations that you have. Obviously, from an assurance perspective, you make sure that they follow the rules in the sense that they comply their reporting with the ESRSs. Well, that is the assurance lens. But we're not only the assurance provider to just tick the box, so to say, but really have a challenging conversation with our clients to make sure that these type of considerations are also thought of.
Just maybe to loop this conversation, it actually brings us back to where we started. If these conversations and dilemmas arise now and happen now, that is because some issues are less evident, or less researched, or less data based, or evidence based. So, and as we witness the availability of this data and the social acceptance maybe of certain issues changes over time. So those dilemmas are temporary maybe in nature, and the value chain recognition is an act of responsibility now, but the more we know about those effects, positive and negatives, and dependencies on nature and society, the more we know as society at large about those, the less dilemmas that will remain for corporate world.
No, I understand. And I was also just thinking about, if you look at it from a, also impact, also risk perspective, I can imagine that if, let's say, your client base, whether you're a shipping company or a totally different company, whether it's very diversified or whether it's very focused, I can imagine that an individual issue would, related to your company, always be less risk. Does that sound weird or not? Because let's say you are fully in one value chain with your company, that's always the same. There's a certain issue that's, let's say, has a big impact on the whole value chain, including you as a company. But if you're a part of, let's say, 8 different sectors or 8 different value chains, then one issue in one of them does not impact your business or relates to your business to a smaller extent, right? What do you think, Audrey? Or how does maybe the regulation look into this?
Yeah,
look at this.
I think from a risk perspective, of course, having one type of value chain and one risk in terms of frequency means that there is then less likelihood of you being exposed to risks. However, the impact in that one value chain might still be significant enough that eventually it will have a more significant risk or pose a more significant risk to your company than even a diversified value chain. So it's difficult to conclude on whether a single value chain or diversified value chain may lead to one or more risks.
Indeed, because the other way around, you could also argue, right? I mean, if you have a more diversified landscape of activities, the more risks you face in your upstream or downstream value chains is obviously also...
and it's also harder to tackle them.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to go everywhere.
Yeah. That's interesting. It may actually bring the shipping company to a decision to ship only goods they know have have minor or no environmental or societal issues.
Linked to them.
What if we actually see this happening, and what if we see some companies take a managerial decision or marketing decision, some strategic decision to actually take this as their competitive advantage?
Yes.
Because that is what the CSRD brings, right? That companies not only look through a financial lens in making investment decisions or company strategic decisions, but also through the lens of ESG. And that is really I think over time we will live and learn, but that is definitely where we're heading.
Cool. So we have a lot of challenges. The companies we help have a lot of challenges, and can we also provide them with some solutions or guide them a bit along the way on the first steps towards solutions? For example, if we talk about, the first one we talked about was the breadth or the width of the value chain, right? And just discussing the examples as well. I don't know who wants to start on this, but what kind of solutions can we offer? What kind of guidance to these companies? What have we seen already?
Yeah, there's a couple of different steps, of course, that companies can take. The first one is, of course, know your industry and discuss challenges with peers as well. Another simple one would also be to familiarize yourself with the standards, of course, to give yourself an idea as to what the requirements on your company are. They can give you an idea in terms of the gaps of information availability that currently exist within your company, so your value chain as well. And eventually also over time, it's a reality we need to face. Information and data availability and quality will become better. So companies will be able to rely on more quantitative information, more sound value chain mappings as the years go on.
Yeah, and how have we seen, have you seen that companies deal with these difficult challenges? So let's say that being aware that the quality, for example, of data in the value chain will improve. I can also imagine that still for a lot of companies today, this is still very difficult, right? So they maybe are now stuck at the point of where they do know that there's something happening at some part of their value chain. There might be some risks or opportunities there, but they are a bit stuck in the granularity of the data maybe, or the openness of the parties in that value chain to connect and to to share this information.
Maybe just to echo what Audrey has outlined, I don't think there's a silver bullet for smaller companies or those not having resources to actually dig into that wealth of knowledge and do your own piece of research, as it requires an enormous amount of time and commitment. However, looking at the CSRD again, which targets largest companies first and public interest entities first, those would have to be pioneers and leverage on what data and evidence is available and make sense of it in regards to what information should be material or should be recommended to be material for certain sectors. This work is actually being already done by IFRAG and certain volunteering companies who are keen to be part of the working groups on sector-specific standards. And as the years go by, there will be this movement continuing. So big, large organizations will actually make more and more sector-specific knowledge available. And I do believe that a contrary push from advocacy organizations, from social movements, will actually spotlight certain blind spots, maybe certain areas of high risk which haven't been addressed yet, to make this information again be researched, explored, and made publicly available.
I can also imagine that it's a really interesting time in that sense for the companies maybe who are at the second or the third row in terms of implementation, because they have a little bit of time to look ahead and see what, let's say, the biggest companies come up with first. It will all be published, right, in reports, so there's some openness there needed. So I can imagine that it also, and maybe also for an assurance provider, maybe that also might be interesting, of course. I mean,
yeah, obviously we will learn a lot from the first wave of companies that need to report, and I think obviously the European Commission selected those companies first for a reason, right? Those have the biggest capacity to really focus on corporate sustainability reporting.
Yeah.
But my biggest advice to the clients is always know that you're not alone in this, right? I mean, you have your assurance provider, you have your advisors, yes, but you also have your peers and your competitors, right? So what I always recommend is talk to your peers, talk to your competitors, even if it's informal, right? You can have formalized groups where sector discussions occur, but also informally. I mean, everybody needs to go through this first cycle of reporting. Yeah. So it's always good to
I can also imagine that from a perspective of, well, maybe learn from each other is a very good thing, but I can also imagine that it's a bit, how to say,
sensitive?
Yeah, sensitive and maybe challenging for companies. What can I share? What can I share? Maybe even sometimes by law, what am I allowed to share and what not? Yeah. Have you already seen examples of this where companies try to reach out to the sector or the same type of companies and?
I can relate to...
What kind of questions come up maybe to you as an advisor? How can I do this?
Well, peer benchmarking has always been a first step to know potentially material issues or topics to a company. We keep on doing this. However, the time is changing, and the double materiality concept is something new. There has never been such thing before. There was impact materiality on one thing, and those financially material risks, less so opportunities, on the other side. So now we should look at topics or even impacts that may materialize as risks at some point at the same time, and this perspective puts companies into a situation where they have to be innovative, they have to pioneer and be explorative. So learning from each other makes the opportunities to learn from what's available scarce, and maybe only, as Midge outlined, informal sector-specific working groups is something that we do see happening. Yeah. So pioneers do know each other, they do team up, and they do disclose what's challenging. We do appraise that. We think learning from each other is the way forward. We do so as well. Yeah. And there's no other way than combining forces for good.
Of course. And I can also imagine that maybe that first year, in which, let's say, companies of similar size will have to start reporting on some things they haven't reported on for the first time. But in the second year, then everyone has reported once, had to be open about all these things, and then the peer comparisons will be easier because there will be more open information available, right? But I think we're going a bit towards the end of this podcast. Thanks a lot. That was it for now, for today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the KPMG ESG Experts podcast. We hope you enjoyed our introduction to some of the challenges that companies face and that you feel a little bit more prepared to tackle those challenges. If you're keen to hear more from our experts on CSRD-related topics, then subscribe to our podcast via the link in the description. And next to that, you can also go to the KPMG website to sign up for our ESG Today newsletter, as well as to check out some articles and events on ESG-related topics. So see you next time.